So let's talk about the Primaris Assault Marines and how strong they are in game with a Space Marine datasheet review for the Jump Intercessors. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines and specifically those with jump packs. Doing a unit review for the Jump Intercessor Squad, one of the most common staple Space Marine units right now. Assault Intercessors with jump packs are really quite a common staple Space Marine unit. You see them cropping up in top tournament lists very regularly. Here's a couple cropping up in a tournament winning Shadowmark Talon list. Here's a squad fighting for the White Scars and their Spearpoint Brotherhood. There's two units in this undefeated Blood Angels Angelic Inheritors list from the London Grand Tournament, and another couple in this Black Templars Gladius Task Force. Looking more widely, and they are one of the most commonly played Space Marine units in general, a quick review of 25 top placing Space Marine army lists has the Assault Intercessors with jump packs being used in 13 of them, so that's more than half there. That seems fairly true for some Divergent chapters as well, maybe a bit of a mix depending on the specific ones. Again, with that same sort of high placing list review, they are quite popular for both the Blood Angels and Black Templars in particular, a little bit less so for Dark Angels and Space Wolves currently it seems. In this video, let's talk about the unit, its place in 40k, why they're good in game, and what supporting options can help them perform to their best. In the lore, the Assault Intercessors with jump packs are essentially the Primaris take on the Assault Marine, classically one of the three major specializations for Space Marine units, most battle companies being made up of tactical squads, devastator squads and assault squads. These guys are Space Marines equipped with bolt pistols and chainswords, propelled through the air by the mighty jump pack, great blasts from the engines on their back propelling them towards the enemy at breakneck speed, turning the Space Marine themselves into almost as much of a weapon as anything they're carrying, just for the sheer amount of mass making impact on the enemy. It also means they can close with the enemy very rapidly, or get over great obstacles that might prevent them from reaching their foe otherwise, or potentially deploy from craft in higher orbit, using the jump packs to slow their descent at the last moment. They're particularly favoured by the Blood Angels and the Vanguard. They're used by basically all Space Marine chapters out there. For example, the Space Wolves have their Sky Claws. Models wise, their sculpts were relatively recent ones as Primaris Space Marines go, coming out towards the start of 10th edition. Fairly straightforward Space Marines with a good sense of motion to them. Rather than going for flying bases, they've got them jumping off terrain. Maybe an aesthetic some people like a bit more than others. The box gets you a few different poses and some war gear choices. The Sergeant has the choice between Power Sword, Power Fist or Chainsword. He can take a Plasma Pistol or Hand Flamer, and another model in the squad can take a Plasma Pistol, as the previous assault squads before could do. As ever, if you were looking to pick up some Space Marines for your armies, check out the discount links in the video description. They can save a fair bit versus Games Workshop, and anything bought through those help to support the channel. There's places like Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off, or Taschengeld in the EU for 16%, plus the discount codes. A big thank you to anyone using those, it does help to keep the videos coming. Let's talk rules though, and at the moment an Assault Intercessor squad with jump packs will cost you 90 points for 5 of them, or 170 for 10, so you get a slightly discounted squad if you take them at the bigger squad size. The reason for that is to try and make them just a little bit more viable as a big damage dealer style squad, as otherwise there wouldn't be much incentive to take them on anything other than small 5-man squads, which is still the preferred way. For that points cost of basically 18 points per model, you get a standard issue Space Marine profile, 2 wounds at toughness 4 with a 3+ save and OC 1. They move 12 inches with the fly keyword, so that means they're going to be getting towards the enemy really quite quickly. They'll likely have good threat ranges if you stage them aggressively in ruins and probably get the jump on the enemy rather than the other way round. Like most Space Marines, they have the grenade keyword, so it could be a nice way to drop off a bit more damage before they make their charge. And they do have the option to deep strike as well, which definitely is an interesting one, as they are a relatively cheap unit that could be doing some secondary objectives when they drop in. Not exactly the cheapest deep strikers that Space Marines can field, there are a few cheaper than them, but certainly in later turns after they've done any grunt work, they'll pack a far bigger punch than most of those. While the main threat is in melee, they can contribute a bit of damage in the shooting phase first. The squad gets the big chunky heavy bolt pistols, 1 shot each at 18 inches, hitting at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1, maybe good enough to account for a wound or 2 on some lighter infantry. 1 marine per 5 of them can take a plasma pistol, and while they remain free in 10th edition, that's an auto include, then the sergeant can either take a hand flamer or plasma pistol on top of that. The plasma pistols are direct upgrades. Against suboptimal targets, they can not bother overcharging and just embrace some higher strength and AP. Against things like enemy Space Marines with 2 wounds, it probably does make sense to overcharge them most of the time. Just being a bit borderline on the sergeant, where you have a small chance to basically snipe your power fist out of the unit, which isn't exactly going to be great for the melee. For the most part, I see more people take plasma pistols, though sometimes people take a hand flamer on the sergeant. Maybe that way being a bit of damage control to make sure that you're not tempted to overcharge and potentially ruin the squad's melee damage. Before we move on to their close combat skills though, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA, their main offering being faction dice that could be appropriate for all sorts of wargaming factions out there. Currently at the moment they have their single biggest sale of the year, 20% off all their dice site-wide with the code ROLL'EM. They've really got a pretty vast amount of variety with their typical offerings, various different colours and flavours of themed faction dice, usually having 25 dice per pack, with a choice of either rounded or squared corners depending on what you prefer. There's plenty of dice that could work well for chapters out there. Their usual prices before the sale being around $32 or £28 for a set, shipping out from the USA, so after shipping it a little cheaper domestically compared with around the world. They also made some rather snazzy dice with a channel logo on as well, feel free to check those out as well. The black design ones seem particularly popular with people. In any case though, check them out, links down in the video description if you want to take a look through their range. They're about as cheap as they'll ever be right now through their Black Friday event. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Getting back to those jump out Space Marines though, and let's get on to their melee damage. The standard close combat profile for the squad gets you 4 attacks at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1 with their chain swords, so a good profile for blending some light infantry there rather well. Then the sergeant gets the choice of either power fist, power sword, or another chainsword. Currently these are badly balanced while they don't have a points cost, and the power fist is quite this powerful. The sergeant gets 3 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, and between the extra strength and damage it's well worth having that rather than just 1 extra attack, and it makes the squad overall really quite efficient into their equivalent, very nice at punching down enemy 2 wound infantry. That's not it for their melee damage output though, as they also get some mortal wounds on the charge. After the squad's completed a charge move, you get to select 1 enemy unit, and for each one of your models that have made it within engagement range of that enemy unit, you roll a dice. On a 4+, they take 1 mortal wound. It means that if you've charged from at least relatively close and you can get the entire squad within engagement range, you're probably going to expect around about 2 or 3 mortal wounds out of a full squad making it in, and that's pretty significant really. Against a particularly good target, you might be killing something like 40 or 50 points worth of model there. A lot of the time though, things might not necessarily be quite that good. You don't get to activate that mortal wound roll for anything that can fight, just models that are literally within engagement range, so if you have models that are fighting in 2 ranks, the back ones won't make that impact hit. Either way though, it's still really quite powerful and makes them a lot more general purpose compared with if they just had their regular damage profiles. Overall for damage and defense, it does mean that they're relatively impressive as Space Marine skirmish units go. Their defense maybe isn't anything too special, but still not standout dreadful for 18 points bodies. They might get a bit of chip damage at range, particularly with a couple of plasma pistols in the squad, but against certain targets in a single melee activation, there's a pretty reasonable chance they could make back the vast majority of their points investment in a single fight phase. Perhaps making a slightly optimistic assumption that you get a full 5-man squad all within engagement range. On average, they wipe out around about 10 termagants, maybe 3 or 4 enemy space marines, and then against tougher targets it's really quite heavily mortal wound dependent, but you might kill around 1 or 2 terminators, or do around 4 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle. In reality, their targets of choice are still going to be the space marines and lighter infantry, but it does make them pretty interesting to know that they will actually contribute to damage output in a meaningful way against tougher stuff as well. Perhaps if you had a depleted enemy elites unit, there's a reasonable chance they could finish them off before getting struck back, or you could whittle down the target that they wanted to charge with some guns. Overall, for pros and cons relative to other Space Marine units, they're pretty fast moving and are a relatively cheap and somewhat expendable unit for screening and secondaries. Their damage output between their ranged attacks, mortal wounds and melee damage does add up to be fairly impressive against the right targets for 90 points, even if it won't be doing loads against tough stuff, and they can have some excess interesting value with certain chapters like the Vanguard and Blood Angels. The downsides, at 90 points they aren't the most expendable Space Marine unit out there, they're pricier than things like Scouts or the Invader ATV. Their mortal wounds could be a letdown if they don't all make it into engagement range, and while they are good at their own role, they've got plenty of competition for other good Space Marine objective skirmisher style units, things like the Phobos Marines, Intercessors and Scouts, and with those all being solid choices at the moment, there's a pretty reasonable chance it makes sense to take some jump intercessors, but not loads. Beyond their datasheet itself, there's plenty of things that could help them out a bit in various ways for their task, though for all the things that can help them, they do feel like a unit that really stands on their own 2 feet. They don't really need all that much support, but they might be able to get something passively from either detachments or characters that happen to be about, and the odd stratagem could be a really big deal to achieve something with utility or damage that they otherwise couldn't. For basic things like all Space Marines, they'll enjoy Oath of Moment, but they might not always be the right targets to use it on. You basically need a turn where you're not having mainline damage dealers struggling to overcome a massive enemy threat, and you need to use it on a smaller, more positional conflicts. But if you could spare it for them, it is going to make them hit significantly harder. Lots of low strength attacks do very well with both 4 rerolls to hit and a +1 to wound if they aren't a Divergent Chapter 1. Perhaps for some of their most relevant common stratagems that they can use, Rapid Ingress could be interesting for a squad in Deep Strike Reserve. Again, it'd probably have top priority for your actual damage dealer units that might be lurking off the table. But again, in the right situation, it could be interesting for them. They could drop down and then threaten to just massively delete an enemy objective grabber, pushing back on the enemy on one objective or one part of the table. If you did want them to punch up against something tough, then Grenade could be pretty excellent. Between that stratagem and the Mortal Wound impact hits, you could expect something around about 5 or 6 mortal wounds against an enemy target. That's getting to the point where they're going to do some pretty significant damage to even things like monsters and vehicles, never mind anything else. Then Armour of Contempt is pretty handy for most Space Marines out there. It could be alright for them if it's going to make the difference between them living or dying on an objective. Again though, like the other stratagems, a pretty reasonable chance it's going to be better on more mainline units as opposed to the objective skirmishers. For characters, they do have the option of leaders. For generic characters in the core codex, there's the captain with jump pack and the chaplain. The captain's 75 points gives you an extra pip of strength on the charge and free stratagems, so you could use Rapid Ingress for free, for example. They tend to be more commonly used with big squads of Vanguard veterans currently, perhaps particularly in Shadowmark Talon at the moment, where you might often see one with the first turn reserves arrival being able to Rapid Ingress in with loads of Vanguard veterans to get the first strike. Jump Intercessors certainly aren't a horrible alternative to that though. They are cheaper, and the Power Fist and the Mortal Wound impact hits do add things. Between the two, I'd probably rate the Captain over the Jump Chaplain. The Jump Chaplain's 75 points and mainly gives you a +1 to wound, plus a few more Mortal Wound impact hits as well. I wouldn't say there's enormous amounts in it as well though. Their Strength 4 attacks can certainly benefit from the +1 to wound. I consider both of these kind of maybe choices, and only if you're building towards the big 10-man squad. Maybe a bit more of a niche damage dealer style option for the Space Marines compared with some. Finally, for the core codex characters that can lead them, there's also Kavan Shrike as well. He's really quite powerful however he's used, but he'll basically stop the squad from getting shot from beyond 12-inch range, so you have really quite a big dangerous unit that's kind of like a lone operative. And if he is in the army, Jump Intercessors are going to have extra value, as his Inspiring Commander gives them OC2. That is legitimately quite useful to have while they're charging onto and scrapping over objective markers. Again, with the Raven Guard, with these sort of cookie-cutter Shadowmark Talon builds, he does tend to be leading up a big squad of 10 Vanguard veterans more so than the Jump Intercessors, though again, realistically, either of them can work well enough, and there will be an element of personal preference there. For all the character options though, they're mostly going to be very happy just operating in 5-man squads without any leaders. If you add a leader to the unit, then they're not really an expendable squad anymore, or will be more competing against your most efficient damage dealer style units for a place. Any detachment buffs for these guys feel like a bit of a bonus as opposed to something that you necessarily need. From the core codex though, there's a few things that maybe incentivize you to use Jump Intercessors more than otherwise. Gladius Task Force is nice for the advance and charge. Potentially fallback and charge could be interesting enough as well to trigger those Mortal Wound impact hits again. And for stratagems, reactive moves are generally nice to have. But also the Lance and extra AP one could be another really interesting way to make sure they properly win one positional fight as opposed to just fall short. Otherwise, for core codex detachments, advance and charge from Stormlance is another solid advantage. The White Scars version will enjoy the melee damage stratagem as well. And in Raven Guard Shadowmark Talon, they're quite nice to have as sort of objective grab markers following on from the big damage dealers. They'll be harder to shoot at longer range from this, like the Vanguard Task Force. It could be an option to return to reserves for a utility unit later on if it doesn't make sense to warp the damage dealers around the table. And having reactive moves and the option for precision melee are both nice as well. Other things can get them some stuff. I say for the most part it doesn't tend to be quite so critical though. In Firestorm Task Force you could have them with a +1 to wound stratagem, though you might be more tempted to take Vanguard veterans there as their fancy pistols get some buffs at closer range. As mentioned for the Divergent chapters earlier, it seems it's the Blood Angels and Black Templars that get the most use out of them. Blood Angels are pretty well known for their Jump Intercessors, and Liberator Assault Group really helps to take them to the next level. They get +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge, and that gets them to some very nice breakpoints. Chainswords going in at strength 6 will be so much scarier against loads of infantry. It's either +1 or +2 to wound against toughness 3, 4, 5 and 6, and the strength 10 Power Fist is another good breakpoint, also helping out against toughness 5 and lighter vehicles. These guys already have fairly solid damage output, and when they're going up to 5 attacks apiece and 4 for the Power Fist, and then hitting super hard, that's going to be rather next level. so pretty good to have a fairly cheap utility units that can also hit quite that hard. Even here though, they still don't typically tend to be taken as 10s as core damage dealers, and that's more because those same buffs can help out some of your more mainline damage threats, things like Sanguinary Guard or Death Company potentially, so it's still probably going to be better to use these guys as skirmishers and the occasional damage punch. For other Divergent chapters, it did seem that Black Templars are the other ones that are really quite popular, kind of similar to the Blood Angels. They're just a better melee threat there, or those chainswords will really enjoy the +1 to wound they get against almost all targets. It just makes them a level up compared with what they'd be normally, and the Black Templars don't have cheap fast units to compete with them so much. Otherwise though, it doesn't seem like they're quite so currently in fashion for the Space Wolves or Dark Angels players. Kind of interesting they get so little looking for Space Wolves despite them having good melee buffs, say in Saga of the Beast Slayer. They do have some other units in a similar sort of price brackets that work very well that are unique ones though, things like Thunderwolves and Thunderhammer Wolfen, so perhaps that's part of the reason for it. Dark Angels could have them be a bit more unusually sturdy in the Wrath of the Rock, but again seem lesser played here. Vanguard veterans having the Deathwing keyword isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world for access to a few better stratagems. For the Deathwatch, they do seem at least fairly common as a cheapest supporting style unit. In general, the Black Spear Detachment isn't doing so very much for them though. In theory, they could return to reserves, but there's almost always going to be better targets for that. For rivals for their battlefield role, they are competing against the other Space Marine utility units. There's loads that you could potentially want, everything from Infiltrators, Intercessors, Incursors, Scouts and more, plus some other cheap deep strikers such as Reavers and Suppressors. For their battlefield role though, I'd say their main rival are the Vanguard veterans. They're just 5 points more and have a similar sort of stat line, so it's very likely that they're going to get compared. The unit profiles here are very similar indeed. Probably the main advantage that the Vanguard veterans get is they get either Storm Shields for a 4+ invulnerable save, or some Inferno pistols or other fancy pistols for free. So you basically have a squad that's either harder hitting at range or harder to take down compared with the Jump Intercessors. Both of these are pretty viable and might get the nod depending on what you might want to do with them. As mentioned, it looks like if you want some big damage dealer units backing up a Hunter's Instincts Captain or Kavan Shrike, then Vanguard veterans seem to be the way to go. The pistol fire in particular might be fairly desired if you're nearly guaranteed to get the Alpha Strike. Otherwise beyond that, Jump Intercessors are a little cheaper at 5 points less, and for their damage output, the Jump Intercessors are going to be a little bit punchier against tougher stuff mostly. Provided they can get their mortal wounds, the mortal wounds will usually tip the balance, at least against things with high saves anyway. Otherwise the Vanguard veterans get the advantage of an extra pip of strength and lethal hits on the charge, but with all their attacks being AP 1 and damage 1, it still means they won't be doing quite as good against high save targets compared with the Jump Intercessors per point. Overall feels like there's room enough for both in the Space Marine army. It seems that most people come down on using Jump Intercessors for small unit skirmishing roles, at least maybe outside of things like Firestorm, and Vanguard veterans for bigger damage dealer sort of roles if you want Jump Infantry for that. Overall though, I'd certainly rate the Assault Intercessors with jump packs as a strong unit for Space Marines right now. Fielding them in game for most chapters, I'd likely take maybe 1 or 2 squads of 5 in an army list, and the 10 strong ones really aren't so bad, particularly for Raven Guard or Blood Angels if you want to with some character support, though they maybe just feel like they're a little behind other units that you might compare for the battlefield role, Vanguard veterans for the Raven Guard and the other jump packs for the Blood Angels. For their war gear, I'd take a Power Fist on the Sergeant and the Plasma Pistols most likely, not really going for too much support beyond that. Perhaps potentially throwing the odd stratagem their way if it's going to make a big difference. For a positional strike, something like a grenade or maybe rapid ingressing in, and depending on the opponent you could use them in different ways, either starting them on the board and staging them behind ruins so you have the option to use them as a sort of trading and screening unit. They should be able to bully their equivalents rather well, or you could potentially put 1 or more squads into Deep Strike Reserve, have them ready to drop down to do secondaries at a moment's notice. If they're not needed for that, they can drop and prepare to charge or rapid ingress. And potentially, if the opponent allows them to survive after doing any grunt work, they're likely to make their presence felt in a good way. Overall, certainly a strong unit for the Astartes right now. Nice to see the standard assault marines of this day and age putting the Emperor's enemies to the chainsword. That's about it for this one though. Let me know your thoughts as to the Jump Intercessors down in the comments below. I look forward to hearing your thoughts or how they get on in game for you. A big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring this one. You can find them linked in the video description below. Check out their sites during the Black Friday times for their 20% off with the code in the video description. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. And check out the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support. Again, it's linked in the video description below. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, The link's in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.